It's Klayton, aka Celldweller, and I'm here today to talk to you about the beautiful, the wonderful Analogue Solutions Leipzig-S. I couldn't have more great things to say about the Leipzig-S from Analogue Solutions. I love this synthesizer, and part of the reason I think this thing is great is not only because it sounds so good, but because I feel like this thing is applicable to not only pro users, but novice users and everyone in between. There's something in here for everyone, and it sounds incredible, and it will bring a sound to your productions like no other synthesizer can. So at its core, the Leipzig has two VCOs, a sub-oscillator, it has a transistor ladder filter, it's got oscillator sync with cross modulation, and there's lots of modulation routing possibilities here. You've got an analog step sequencer which control VCO1, VCO2, or the filter, and you can control them over MIDI, or you can use the built-in LFO or one of the oscillators to control the rate of the step sequencer, and you can get some really cool effects using all variations of those things. And another thing it does really well is process external signals. So if you want to run drum loops or soft synths through this synth, easily done, and it really adds an element of sonic quality to those sounds. And I'm going to show you examples of both of those things in a little bit. You know what else the Leipzig-S does really well? Giorgio Moroder. So I want to walk through some of the core features, and right now I'm actually sending MIDI from Cubase to this, and I have this in MIDI key mode, which means that the step sequencer in the Leipzig is only going to progress every time it receives a MIDI note. I'll show you examples of when that works and why a little bit later, but for right now, don't worry about it. We're just going to focus on the sound of it and kind of what the core architecture is. So let's start with VCO1, and I'm going to pull up just a straight up square wave. You have pulse width control here, which you can hear. And you can actually modulate that pulse width using envelope 2. You have a triangle wave that you can also, which is the LFO up here. I'm going to use, just so you can hear it, very simply, I'm going to use envelope 2 right now to control the pulse width modulation. That's a single oscillator, which already sounds great. Let's bring in VCO2, which I will also have as a square wave. And I'll bring in some pulse width modulation on that as well. You've got a detune here, which will detune those oscillators. And I know you're thinking, wow, that sounds really fat. Well, it gets much fatter than that because we haven't even touched the filter or the sub-oscillator. So listen to this sub-oscillator. The sub-oscillator also goes down 1 octave or 2 octaves. You have the choice depending on which way you turn the dial. There's your sub-oscillator. Let's get into the filter. And let's detune that a little bit. So you can hear pretty immediately how fat this can get very quickly with only a couple of oscillators. You have so many modulation options that bring so much more size to those oscillators, never mind the filter, and we haven't even gotten into the step sequencer yet, or the modulation section. So we've kind of barely scratched the surface, but there is one sound in analog synths that I really love, and that's hard sync, and the Leipzig-S does that really, really well. So I want to show you an example of kind of what hard sync sounds like on this box. So I've got hard sync on, and I'm going to use in the modulation section, I'm going to use VCO2, I'm going to use envelope 2 to modulate VCO2, which is going to create that hard sync effect, so you can kind of hear it modulating VCO2, which is creating that reset on the wave. Let's get into the Leipzig's step sequencer. There are 8 steps, and there are various ways you can control this. So, like I was saying, if you're a pro user or a novice user or somewhere in between, you can find a way to use this because it's very flexible. So, if you have no other hardware and you don't have MIDI and you don't have external clock that you can clock a sequencer, you don't need one. You can use the LFO to create as a clock source to control the tempo of your step sequencer. You can also use VCO2. So the rate of VCO2 can also control the step sequencer, which creates some pretty interesting results. So let me use the LFO. I'll switch over to the LFO over here. And as you can see, the step sequencer is running based on the rate of your LFO. This is not using MIDI at all. It's just totally using the LFO to run the speed of your sequencer. Right now in my destination section over to the right, you can see that I have no modulation being sent to anything. So you're seeing the step sequencer run, but you're not hearing it do anything. So let's say one note is very boring to you. You don't want to hear one note. You can use your VCO 1 and 2 destination knobs to send pitch information to VCO 1 or 2 or both. Or just one. So I'm only sending pitch information to VCO2, which is creating that effect. Let's go back to hard sync. You can also send this thing MIDI clock from a DAW, which is great, but what it also does is it keeps this sequencer running in consistent 16th note divisions. So if your pattern is not constant 16th notes, things can get a little weird or creative depending on how you want them. But the Leipzig has another great function that Tom has built into this, Tom Carpenter, who designed this. It's built into the sequencer, which is really useful, and it's called the MIDI key mode, and that means that when you have a MIDI cable plugged in, anytime you strike a MIDI key, that advances the sequencer by 1 step. So you can create any pattern you want, and the sequencer will only advance as it's getting note values. So when I put it in MIDI key mode, and I actually start Cubase, which has some MIDI notes I plunked in, you'll see the sequencer run at the rate that I've programmed in my MIDI notes. And here's my click so you can hear that they're totally tied together. So as you can see, Cubase is controlling the tempo and the pattern of the step sequencer based on the MIDI notes that I'm sending it when you are in MIDI key mode. Now we're not even really using the step sequencer yet to control the filter cutoff, which is a whole new level of fun. And let me show you that right now. So we're going to use the same sequence. I'm going to leave hard sync on. It's going to be modulating VCO2. I've got the sub oscillator on 1 octave down, which sounds great. And I'm going to now start modulating the filter cutoff, and all of these parameters are sending control voltages based on where they are to the filter and also to VCO2 at the same time. Let's listen to that. I don't know about you, but I'd be willing to break the law and try to marry that filter because it sounds that good. Another thing the Leipzig does really well is percussion, analog drums. You can make kick drums, snare drums. For instance, here's using the white noise generator that is built into the Leipzig. You can create a snare or hi-hat sound very easily and then use this manual trigger button just to kind of hear it. So as a guy who lives in both worlds, in the analog and the digital world, this box appeals to both sides of me. And I want to show the digital side for those of you out there who are primarily in the box and are looking for a really good piece of analog hardware to bring fat warmth to their productions. And I don't even necessarily mean just synthesis. This also processes external signals. So I'm going to actually process a drum loop, and I'm going to use a great VST, which is Silent, and I'm going to run that through the internal filter and VCA and everything else and show you what you can do with a piece of hardware to bring life to your digital world. So this will be completely dry. There's no external effects, not even compression. So you're hearing this coming straight out of the Leipzig right now. Here's the raw loop. And for those of you saying, oh, that kind of sounds familiar, I think I used a variation of that loop somewhere in the bridge of my song Symbiont on my debut Celldweller album. So now let's start engaging the filter section and the envelope section and hear what we can kind of do with that simple loop. And then a little bit into it, I'm going to actually bring the sub-oscillator and some of the oscillators in combined with that loop, which you can do, and listen to how much fun you can have. Sorry, I can kind of get lost for days doing just this. And I have. And I hope that you will too. So let's have even more fun and take this process signal and go into this cool little box, the Retromechanical Labs Electron Fuzz, and distort the crap out of this beat. Sounds a little like this. Let's get crazier. So I want to show you one last example of what you can do with this processing external audio. And for a lot of you, you probably use soft synths in the box. And for many of you, you probably don't have much hardware and you think, okay, so I've got all these cool soft synths in the box, but if I got a piece of hardware, how can I make it sound more like that hardware and bring that sound to the software? Well, that's very simple. You do the same thing I just did with the drum loop. You run it into the Leipzig-S, and I'm going to show you what that sounds like because it really does add an element to your sound, your in-the-box sound that you can't really get in the box. So I'm using a really great soft synth called Silent. Many of you are familiar with it, and I'm using just a straight-up saw wave, and I have just a static pitch that's changing a little bit, but there's really nothing triggering the VCA. This is what it sounds like. So that's pretty boring unto itself, and it's meant to be. So let's now hear just that into the Leipzig and see what we can do using the step sequencer, the filters, and the rest of the architecture here. Thanks for sticking all the way through this episode of Celldweller Production. I hope you learned how cool the Leipzig-S is, and I hope that you hear a place in your productions for it in the future. So you can find this thing online, go look it up, go get it, and I can't wait to hear the sounds you make with it. There's more content like this coming to my channel, so subscribe and make comments because I do read them. And until next time, this is Klayton, aka Celldweller, signing off.